Hi, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to look at the 10 most important Flash stories that could very well serve as scripts for a movie in the next DC cinematic universe. Number 10. Flash of Two Worlds. You see, today it's all about the multiverse. Marvel and DC are investing heavily in this concept, which consists of the existence of parallel universes, in which different choices generate a completely alternative world with infinite possibilities. What you may not know is that in comics, Flash was responsible for starting this whole trend in the distant year of 1961 in issue number 123 of the Heroes comics. In the story written by Gardner Fox, Barry Allen vibrates his molecules to perform a magic trick and ends up in another universe. This new universe happens to be the universe of the original Flash, Jay Garrick. For the first time, DC explored the concept of the multiverse and promoted a meeting of two versions of the same hero. Like every good crossover, after an initial awkwardness, Jay and Barry team up to defeat three villains from that reality using super speed and the power of friendship. In the comic, Jay Garrick had retired, but after meeting Barry, he decided to return to using the Red Mantle, returning to act as the Flash of his world. This is a very simple story, with a very short, tight arc, and at the time it didn't feel that important. What no one knew at the time was that this would be the start of something huge, the creation of a concept that would be heavily explored in comics from that day forward, be it for big events, casual crossovers, reboots, retcons, and even starting new cinematic universes. All because of a cheap magic trick that went wrong. Number 9. The return of Barry Allen. After the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths, fans were left without Barry Allen, who for years remained dead in the comics. However, between issues number 74 and number 79 of the Flash comics, written by Mark Waid in 1993, to the general delight of fans, we saw the triumphant return of Barry Allen. Or nearly so. Years after his death, Barry Allen just showed up one day at the West family Christmas party, much to everyone's shock, as if nothing had happened. From there, an adventure begins in which Wally West feels conflicted about having taken on his mentor's mantle and doesn't know how to fit in with two Flashes acting together. But to everyone's surprise, Barry Allen starts to act very strangely, with unnecessary violence and even being rude to Wally at times. Only then did we find out that that guy dressed as the Flash and looking like Barry Allen was actually a certain villain, who usually wears the yellow suit instead of the red suit. Yes, the person impersonating Barry Allen was Eobard Thawne, the Reverse Flash. But he didn't even know he was a villain. Eobard, Barry Allen's greatest enemy, reveals in this story that he has yet to meet Barry Allen. He came from a timeline where technology was so advanced that crime no longer existed, but it was also a time without superheroes. At that time, Eobard was Barry Allen's biggest fan. He even changed his own face with plastic surgery to look like Barry and decided to use the cosmic treadmill to travel back in time and find his hero, replicating the accident that gave Barry his super speed. However, Thawne traveled to the wrong era, years after Barry Allen's death, when Wally West had taken up the mantle. Thawne visited the Flash Museum and imagined that he had been brought to this timeline for one reason: to continue the legacy of Barry Allen and become the new Flash of this time. Due to his new objective, he started to study several enemies of the Flash, mainly the Reverse Flash, the Scarlet Speedster's greatest enemy. As the Reverse Flash's name, Eobard Thawne, had been lost to time and became unknown to the public in the 25th century, Thawne was unaware that he himself was going to become the Reverse Flash. But in the 20th century, everyone knew his name, and when he discovered his future identity, plus the fact that his greatest hero was going to be his assassin, the shock sent Thawne into a state of extreme confusion and madness, making him believe he was Barry Allen. Time travel, it messes with anyone's head. Number 8. Terminal Velocity. This story forever changed the mythology of the Flash. During the Zero Hour event, a rift in time restructured the entire DC universe. During the battle, Wally West sacrificed himself to save the time stream and was hurled through time. During his travels, he has a vision of the future in which he and Linda Park are both dead. After returning to the present, he begins to experience a strange change. Every time he runs too fast, he starts to transform into pure energy, which slowly causes him to lose his humanity, being gradually absorbed by something called the Speed Force. When Terminal Velocity, which is also written by Mark Waid, begins, Wally is back in his own time with the knowledge of Linda's fate still fresh in his mind. He does not accept this fact and tries to change the future in every way. However, the Speed Force itself tries to prevent the Flash from changing this reality, because this death is a fundamental point for this timeline. Wally then decides to train Bart Allen, also known as Impulse, to take his place. Even so, when facing a group of supervillains, Wally is forced to run as fast as he can to save Linda and ends up being absorbed by the Speed Force. At the end of the story, a few issues later, the Flash manages to find a way back from the Speed Force. This is an arc about sacrifice, one that showcases the full power of Wally West as the Flash and proves, once and for all, that he is just as powerful as Barry Allen. Terminal Velocity is the story that brought the Speed Force into the Flash mythology for the first time in issue number 100, giving readers a first clue as to what gives speedsters their power. Thereafter, the Speed Force would become a major presence in the Flash stories and would be revealed to be the energy field that keeps all universes in the DC multiverse in harmony. Number 7. Blitz. If you follow the Flash stories, you should know that Wally West is the third incarnation of the hero who replaced Barry Allen after his death. And like any hero, this new Flash needed a powerful new villain. Well, that's exactly the origin story of Wally West's great enemy, Zoom. In this arc, written by Geoff Johns in 2003, we are introduced to Hunter Zolomon, a police officer and friend of Wally West, who helps him fight crime. Unfortunately, during an attack by Gorilla Grodd, Zolomon is hit and ends up losing the use of his legs. He then asks Wally West to use the Cosmic Treadmill, which is in the Flash Museum, to go back in time and prevent this from happening. Wally says he can't risk damaging the timeline and refuses to help, as if the Flashes didn't change the timeline 3 times before breakfast. Zolomon then breaks into the museum at night and attempts to use the treadmill himself. The resulting explosion destroys the museum and changes Hunter's connection to time. He could now change his location in time, giving the effect of super speed. That means Hunter Zolomon doesn't have any connection to the Speed Force. He's not even a speedster. What he does is change his own position in timeline, always moving forward, giving the impression that he has unlimited super speed. As the explosion also drove the guy completely insane, he came to believe that Wally West had refused to help him because, unlike the previous Flash, Wally had never suffered a personal tragedy. Zolomon then decided that if he became the villain and killed West's wife, Linda Park, it would help the Flash become a better hero. Thus, the villain took on not only the name, but even the colors of Barry Allen's old enemy, Professor Zoom. He went on to call himself Zoom. In one of the first fights between these two speedsters, the blows are so powerful and they spend so much energy going one after the other that they circle the world dozens of times in a fraction of a second. Flash managed to defeat Zoom, preventing Linda's death, and Hunter Zolomon ended up frozen in a temporal anomaly, continually reviewing his own father's death, at least for a while. Number 6. The Death of Iris West. As with Peter Parker, Bruce Wayne, and even Superman, the Flash has also lost his beloved girlfriend. The story, from 1979, written by Cary Bates, tells about the day Iris West died. It all begins with the couple Barry and Iris going to a costume party to try to save their marriage, which was in crisis. Barry was dressed as the Flash and Iris as Batgirl. However, the villainous Clive Yorkin had crashed that party with a plan to take the life of Barry Allen's wife. The villain drugged Barry and shot Iris, arousing the wrath of the hero, who throughout this arc seeks to bring the criminal to justice and avenge the death of his beloved. As the story progresses, we discover that Clive didn't plan it all alone, and that a certain villain in the yellow uniform was also involved. This story is very remarkable, as it brings a very serious consequence to Barry Allen's life as a hero. Iris has been present in the Flash comics since the first comic. Losing this character after nearly 300 issues came as a shock to fans. I mean, important characters had died before, but those deaths were always undone at the end of the story. Either they were a hoax, or the character was just in a death-like state or miraculously rose from the dead. But Iris West died and stayed dead, leaving Barry to mourn the loss and try to move on with his life. Eventually, in 1985, we found out that Iris was still alive, but by the time of this story, her death was assumed to be permanent. While this story may seem rather simplistic by modern standards, it was quite complex and groundbreaking for its time. Unlike today's comics, which are aimed at teenagers and adults, comics in the 1970s were written mostly for children. So seeing Iris West die and not come back was a pretty shocking moment for young readers. Number 5. Menace of the Reverse Flash. We've already talked about Wally West's greatest villain, and now it's time for the origin story of Barry Allen's greatest archenemy and most dangerous in his entire rogues gallery. We're talking about Eobard Thawne, also known as Professor Zoom or Reverse Flash. The great thing, in this case, is that the emergence of this character is not that classic story that everyone knows, of the big fan of the Flash's deeds, who goes back in time to meet his hero and ends up becoming the greatest villain in the Flash's gallery. Eobard's first origin is pretty simple actually. In issue number 139 of the Heroes comics, written by John Broome in 1963, we finally discovered the origin of Eobard Thawne, a citizen of the year 2463, who found a time capsule set in the 20th century to space, which returned to Earth in the 25th century. Such a capsule would have been corrupted and turned into a bomb. Barry Allen volunteered to travel to the future using his powers to prevent a tragedy from happening. In the same capsule, there was also a Flash costume. The person who found the capsule in the future, this guy named Eobard, wanted to become the biggest criminal in the world, and using a Tachyon device, he amplified the residual speed energy of the 20th century suit, giving himself speedster abilities. As a final touch, he reversed his suit's colors and became the Reverse Flash. When he arrives in the 25th century, Barry does not find the bomb, nor his uniform, and discovers that someone is committing crimes, using his powers and an outfit very similar to his. After an encounter with a villain, Barry defeats him and hands him over to the authorities. About the bomb, he discovers that an old lady found it and took it home, as a relic of times gone by. Flash finds the bomb and detonates it in a safe place, returning to his time afterwards. All settled, isn't it? Well, more or less. The design of this futuristic villain was so successful among fans that DC Comics decided to develop the character better over the years. Of course, his origin was changed several times in the comics until it became the Flash's own origin story, which had his destiny changed by the Reverse Flash when the villain killed his mother. But in the beginning, Eobard Thawne was just a simple villain with a terrible name and a cool costume. Number 4. Rebirth. Barry Allen's death in Crisis on Infinite Earths was one of the most impactful moments in comic book history and one of the rare moments where there were consequences in comics. After the Crisis, Wally West was celebrated as DC's new Flash, and he wore that mantle for the next 23 years, and for all that time, we hadn't had any return from Barry. But since we're talking about comics, as impactful as the death of a hero is, at some point he comes back. And with Barry Allen it was no different. In 2009, the hero finally returned. This 6-issue miniseries, written by Geoff Johns, tells how, after the sacrifice, Barry was taken into the Speed Force by the Black Flash, the death of the speedsters, and remained there. But in Rebirth, Professor Zoom mysteriously returns from death and recreates the accident that gave Barry his powers, so that the villain can create his own version of the Speed Force, which will little by little contaminate the original Speed Force. But what's the use of all that power if there's no Barry Allen for him to torment? He then discovers a way to bring Barry Allen back from the Speed Force to turn Barry into the next Black Flash, making the hero kill every speedster he touches. In this comic, in a great meta-language move, Barry Allen causes his own transformation into the Scarlet Speedster when he becomes the very lightning that fell in the laboratory years ago. With that, Barry once again donned DC's most famous red mantle, and from then on, he continued to be the main Flash in comics and adaptations for animations, series, and movies. Number 3. Rogue War. In yet another story written by Geoff Johns, this time in 2005, we have one of Wally West's last adventures as DC's main Flash, before returning the mantle to Barry Allen. In that story, the Rogues, the group with some of the Flash's greatest supervillains, led by Captain Cold, recruited new members to reform the team. Meanwhile, another group of bad guys is recruited by the FBI to capture those bad guys. Obviously, this couldn't end well, and the confrontation between the two groups causes unprecedented destruction in Keystone City. And Wally West's problems didn't end there. When the speedster decided to get into the fight, Zoom, Hunter Zolomon, appeared to make everything even worse. Hunter Zolomon's main goal in the comics has always been to force Wally West to become a better hero. The method? Making Wally go through extreme trauma, believing that this is the only way to understand how to better himself. During Rogue War, Zolomon uses Eobard Thawne's help to go back in time and drag Wally back to the day he made Linda abort their children, forcing the hero to watch that moment over and over again. Fortunately, Wally enlisted the help of past Barry Allen to get rid of Zoom and return to save Keystone City, finding a reality a little different from the one he had left before. Instead of losing the babies in this new reality, Linda Park had 2 children. Congratulations, Daddy. Number 2. Flashpoint. Of course that arc would have to appear at the top of the list. Flashpoint is one of the best Flash stories, shows the weight of Barry's choices, and of course, shows a sensational alternate world. This story is so good that it has already been adapted into animations on the CW's Flash series and is now the inspiration for the new Speedster movie, which has just hit theaters. In the comics, the original story was written in 2011 by Geoff Johns and is already part of this new era of Flash after the return of Barry Allen. The premise is simple yet brilliant. Barry returns to the past to prevent his mother's murder, and when he returns to the present, he sees a world completely different from the one he knew. His mother is alive in this new reality, but many other things have been changed. Barry no longer has his powers, the Atlanteans and the Amazons are locked in a war that threatens to tear the world apart, and Batman. Well, Batman is a ruthless and brutal vigilante, but it's not Bruce Wayne, it's his father, Thomas Wayne, who survived the alley robbery that killed his son. This arc was so cool that it spawned several parallel stories in this universe and yet another learning lesson about the consequences of changing the past. And, as expected, the Reverse Flash also appears here as a key part of the plot. It's a work of art that almost made it to the top of our list if it weren't for our number one. Crisis on Infinite Earths, The Final Fate of the Flash. I know, technically this isn't a Flash-only story, but it still has great historical importance. The Crisis were the biggest and most important event in comic book history and dictated the biggest DC reboot of all time. During the 1980s, publisher executives decided that DC Comics needed a big event to start all over again and undo the mess of that multiverse. Thus, Crisis on Infinite Earths was born. In that story, the villain Anti-Monitor planned to destroy all universes with his antimatter cannon. At the end of the arc, after thousands of twists and turns, it is Barry Allen who sacrifices himself to destroy the villain's weapon. Flash ran around the cannon with all his speed, causing the destruction of the weapon and his own death as a result. As with Wally West years later, Barry ran so fast that he could see glimpses of his past, present and future, becoming one with the Speed Force. The decision to kill off the Flash was so significant that DC decided to respect the choice and keep Barry off the shelves for 23 years. A consequence never before seen in the history of comics. During the 2 decades of Barry's absence, Wally West, the former Kid Flash, took on the Red Mantle, starring in some of the stories we discussed here. But none of them was as remarkable as Barry's sacrifice, which saved the multiverse and started a long tradition in comics of always placing the Flash as one of the great agents of change in the direction of the publisher. To this day, when DC needs to do a full or partial reboot of its universe, it often manages to send the Flash back in time to mess things up a bit. So what did you think of these stories? Do you have any stories to add? Subscribe to the channel to receive many other content like this. See you in the next video.